Authenticity in Contemporary Fiction. A case study of Ray Shell's debut novel, Iced. Back when I was in high school, I'd often come home and complain to my mum about how uninterested I was in the books we were being assigned to read in English class. She'd ask me why, and my answer would often be something along the lines of, "Its portrayal of teenagers is just so unrealistic. It's all I can focus on." I found it incredibly hard to become immersed in contemporary novels that felt inauthentic, and would often be able to tell very quickly if a book centered around the lives of modern-day teenagers had been written by an adult who hadn't really bothered to spend time around actual young people before putting pen to paper. Therefore, once I got old enough to realize that writing my own stories could be something I might end up doing in my future career, I knew that writing authentically and realistically would be one of my top priorities. As I read more and exposed myself to a greater amount of films and television programs, I realized that lack of authenticity within contemporary fiction and films can exist in many different ways, and is certainly not confined to representations of the younger generations within teen and young adult novels. I'm sure that amongst the vast sea of novels in the literary world, there are countless examples of one-dimensional, unrealistic characters who are built on stereotypes, generalizations, or what could be considered to be the more innocent culprit, inadequate research. After being introduced to the novel by my dad, it became apparent to me that Iced by Ray Shell certainly does not fall into this category. Shell's contemporary fiction novel follows the life of its protagonist, Cornelius Washington, an extremely talented and driven young Black American man from New York City, with a promising future, who gets involved with casual drug use and eventually spirals into hardcore addiction, becoming completely consumed by his need to track down, purchase, and use crack cocaine. Through a stream of consciousness-style series of diary entries, the reader is thrusted into the inner workings of the character's psyche, as he relives the harrowing events that led him from being known as Cornelius Washington, Columbia University scholarship prodigy, to Cornelius Washington, 44-year-old brain-dead junkie, a prime example of wasted potential. Often without the knowledge of what pushed them towards succumbing to things such as addiction, and what factors influenced the cycle to be perpetuated, many people form opinions about those living in tough situations, and hold the perception that their lifestyles are the way they are due to the individuals themselves making the conscious choice to go down that path. This is often due to the fact that many people find it hard to view the world from a lens other than their own, therefore failing to understand why one would ever turn to things such as hard drugs if they themselves had never had the urge to. And therein lies the importance of well-researched, authentic writing, with its most vital element, in my own opinion, being believable characters. So, what makes a character believable? And how does this apply to Shell's protagonist, Cornelius? According to Stephen King in his memoir, On Writing, and I quote, "No one is the bad guy, or the best friend, or the whore with a heart of gold in real life," end quote. And that's why it's imperative that when we build characters, we ensure that they are multifaceted, flawed, and human, with their own unique desires, motivations, and behaviours, instead of just some trope or cliche with a first and last name. For example, in the opening pages of the novel, Shell includes a poem written by Cornelius in which he reminisces fondly about his past, stating, "Cornelius Jr. had it all figured out at 15 and 6 months. He was his mama's joy and his father's pride." Continuing on to remember how, at age 16 I entered Columbia and for 2 whole years my life was paradise. Now, if Shell had just left it at that, had he simply outlined how gifted and successful Cornelius was as a child, without divulging the bigger picture behind what motivated him to be so driven and dedicated to his education, the reader is likely to believe that he simply had it all, and his switch from wonder child to addict must have been his fault and his fault only. This would deem the character to come across as one-dimensional, hard to relate to, and difficult to empathise with. Instead, Shell chooses to make it known that Cornelius' father was a violent abuser. In a separate poem that is shown a few pages later, He states that he was lethal and sadistic and would use belt buckles, wire hangers, and even heated irons on him. Cornelius tells the reader that I obeyed out of sheer fear. I craved his approval fiendishly. His approval, his praise, was the rock of my existence. He then goes on to open up about how whilst Cornelius was studying at Columbia, his own brother Nate found himself battling a heroin addiction, and tragically ended up dead after a long stint in the ICU due to falling ill with pneumonia as a result of his lifestyle. After this happened, their father blamed Cornelius for his brother's death, stating that if you had stayed your ass at home, this would have never happened, referring to his son moving to the dorms instead of staying home to keep an eye on his brother. The way in which the protagonist paints a picture of his childhood relationship with his father includes terminology he also uses to describe his now middle-aged addict self, such as the words craved fiendishly and his validation was the rock of my existence. This indicates that young Cornelius's mind was programmed during his upbringing to seek pleasure, to receive somewhat of a high from his father's approval and praise, because he knew that if he did not impress him enough to receive that positive enforcement, he would instead face intense brutality and pain. Nate's death caused their father to stop viewing Cornelius as a prodigy, and his words of admiration turned into blame and resentment for his son. And with the absence of his father's dopamine-inducing words, Cornelius began to seek the feeling elsewhere. These details aid in challenging the notion that addiction is a choice made by those who suffer from it, and gives Shell's protagonist a motivation for not only his scholarly ambitions in his youth, but also exposes the foundations partially responsible for increasing his susceptibility to falling into full-blown addiction in his later years. As shown within Ray Shell's Iced, the vital nature of well-informed, authentic writing cannot be overstated. Inauthentic characters and unrealistic portrayals can detract from the reader's ability to fully immerse themselves in a story. Iced is a prime example of a well-written, authentic novel that takes it upon itself to truthfully portray the complexities of addiction. By creating multifaceted characters who possess their own unique desires, motivations, and behaviours, authors can create believable characters that are easy to relate to and empathise with. The inclusion of details that challenge commonly held perceptions and expose the underlying factors that contribute to things such as addiction can further increase the authenticity and impact of a story. As writers, we should strive to create honest, authentic stories in order to influence readers to confront their prejudices, be open to adapting their perspectives, as well as to deepen their level of understanding of the experiences of those who live outside the realm of what they have always known.